Let's jump into this. Thank you all for being here. Welcome to Beaver Institute's, this is our August edition of Beavers Uncovered. It's a webinar series on underexplored beaver topics curated by Dr. Bonnie Gulas-Wroblewski and the Beaver Institute. So grateful for Bonnie's ongoing support in pulling these together and really being thoughtful and helping us identify themes and topics and presenters. So thank you so much, Bonnie. Bonnie is going to be assisting me and going to be wrangling some of the questions and sort of helping facilitate our dialogue after the presentations today. A little bit about the Beaver organization, a little bit about our organization, the Beaver Institute. We're a national nonprofit providing the tools and skills for climate resilient communities to coexist alongside beavers and the bountiful ecological and economic services they provide. Essentially, we're here to steward the embrace of beavers across the landscape through our programs and resources. This webinar series, along with our Beaver Corps wetland professional training, are integral. They're an integral part of our strategy to educating the general public and expanding beaver consciousness and beaver-human coexistence across North America and the globe, wherever beavers are. This webinar series in particular looks to weave disparate experiences in the beaver world, gathering us in a virtual imaginarium of possibility and opportunity. So without further ado, I'm very excited to introduce you to our panelists today. And I'm particularly excited about this topic because I know very little about it. So I'm going to be learning a lot today alongside hopefully everyone here. Thank you to our panelists. First, Dr. Katie Holzer is a watershed scientist with the City of Gresham, Oregon. She completed her doctoral degree in conservation ecology at the University of California, Davis, where she studied amphibian habitats in urban and agricultural areas in the Pacific Northwest. Her research focuses on the human-animal ecosystem connections affecting urban stormwater runoff and its impact on freshwater habitats and water quality. Deni Murray completed her master's in freshwater ecology and biogeochemistry at Utah State University and is now a PhD candidate at the University of New Hampshire. Deni has conducted extensive transdisciplinary research into nutrient cycling in beaver ponds in the Western U.S. She is also an advocate for the incorporation of environmentally focused ethics into scientific research and has proposed the Environmental Responsibility 5R framework to guide ecologically conscious environmental studies. And I believe that we have a link to that work here in the chat box. And yeah, everyone feel free just to keep popping in and saying where you're coming from and saying hello. We are going to have the chat box open along with the Q&As. So as we go through the presentations, don't be shy to put your thoughts in there, and we'll try to integrate them when we open up for a dialogue. So without further ado, I want to hand the mic over to Katie, who's going to present to us first.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Adam. Thanks for being here today. I appreciate the invite, and I'm excited to see everyone showing up and coming from all sorts of different places. Let me see if I can get this screen shared here. Let's see. Are you able to see my full screen over here?
We see it. Yep.
Okay, perfect. Excellent. So I'm Katie Holzer. I work for the City of Gresham in Oregon, which is a suburb of Portland. And my role here is to do environmental monitoring and try to help understand how the human environment is having impacts on our local ecosystems and how we can help mitigate that. I work a lot in stormwater treatment. And beavers are something that I never planned to work on. They kind of just kept popping up in opportune and inopportune places. And they started to be sort of a really central focus of all these different facets of what the city was trying to do and bringing along all of the benefits and the challenges that they bring with them. So I've ended up spending quite a bit of time learning about the beavers in our local urban ecosystem here and sort of how they interact with water quality. So today I'm going to tell you a bit about how the beavers have been increasing in Gresham, and then tell you briefly about 3 small studies that we've done on the benefits of those beaver populations in the city. So a little bit about the stormwater runoff, and then about stream temperatures, and then stream complexity. And then at the end, I'm going to talk about some of the conflicts that you can have with, beavers anywhere, but especially in urban engineered systems, and things that we've been doing that can help with coexistence. So for the stormwater portion, this is am I missing a slide here? Well, I'll just tell you briefly that beavers in general in Gresham have been increasing a lot over the last decade or two, which is probably true of many areas throughout this continent, especially urban areas. And it seems that, you know, as the populations are increasing in general, and as they are, as urban areas are starting to be restored, we're starting to reconnect them, remove some of the culvert barriers, replant some areas. The beavers have really been moving in. And when I started working here about 10 years ago, we did a beaver survey sort of through the middle of town, and we saw 1 or 2 beaver dams. And then when we redid that survey last year, we found about 30 beaver dams all along this creek throughout the middle of the city. So they've really been moving in, and people have been noticing them. And one of the places that we didn't expect them to move in was in some of our stormwater infrastructure. So this is a facility that is in Gresham that was built as a retrofit, where there was a lot of stormwater runoff that was running directly into the streams without any treatment at all. So every time it rained, all these pollutants would wash off of the parking lots and the roads and the roofs and wash directly into a stream with no treatment, because this area of the city was built a long time ago before we were building a lot of treatment. And from this graphic here, you can see with these large roofs that a lot of this area was an industrial area. So there's additional pollutants coming in from industry. And so there's a large constructed wetland that was built right at the end of where these pipes were entering into the stream. The wetland itself is about 13 acres. And the area it's draining is almost 1,000 acres of urban area. And when the facility was built, it was this big flagship facility that it was the first sort of big constructed wetland that the city had built. It cost millions of dollars. We had to get all these grants, and it had this really sort of complicated, highly engineered design where the water would come in, it would go through these sediment forebays and drop out some sediment, and then it would kind of go back and forth through this series of channels so that it had a lot of time to be in contact with plants and soil and help clean out some of those pollutants. And it would sort of go down these little cascading rock waterfalls here to the outlet. And it went in, things were working well, and then suddenly when we'd go out to check it, it wasn't quite functioning the way we had expected. Water was coming through in odd ways that wasn't quite in the design. And when we investigated further, we found that a family of beavers had moved into this constructed wetland. And they had built a series of dams. It turns out these nice little constricted sort of rock waterfalls that we had made were the perfect spot for beavers to come just build a 5 or 10 foot dam and block up the whole area behind it. And all these plants here are willows, which beavers love. So, you know, in retrospect, of course, they're attracted to this 13 acres of willows with these little constrictions that have the sound of running water that they can just block up so easily. So they built sort of 2 large dams here, where now the water sort of ponds up in these 2 ponds and then flows through these dams before it goes out. And it's really different than going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth until it goes out. And so when this happened, some of the design staff and the engineers were kind of freaking out about, oh no, this is really different. What do we do about it? You know, this animal's coming in and completely changing everything. And there was a huge variety of opinions on it. You know, there was everywhere from people who were like, yes, this is amazing, and beavers are the most amazing animal, and they should be everywhere, and this is exactly what should be happening, versus these are, you know, varmint pests that are coming and, you know, completely destroying our fancy facility here. And so what my role was I was able to help say, well, let's figure out if these beavers are helping or hindering in the main goal of this facility, which is to help clean the water, right? So I was able to take a step back and do a multi-year study to see, well, how is the facility functioning with the beaver dams and without the beaver dams? And so we collected stormwater samples during storms. So you go out when it's raining really hard and look at that runoff coming in. Here's an example of what the water looks like coming in. And then you test the water going out, and this is the water going out. And see how much of the pollutants are being cleaned. And we had a total of 7 storms where the dams were present and 7 storms where the dams were absent. So luckily we had already had some data from before there were any dams, and then we had a bunch of data when there was dams. And then as part of this, we actually went in and removed all the dams, and so got some more data with them absent. And then of course the beavers came in and built them back. And so we got some more data with them present. And we're looking at common stormwater pollutants like heavy metals, nutrients, sediment, pesticides. And we wanted to sort of see how it was going. And one thing that I wanted to note that was interesting, when we went and were removing these dams, here's a salamander that I found living inside the dam. We removed them at the end of summer. It was really dry out. They were sort of just full of these frogs and salamanders that were using the dam itself as a cool, moist place to be. We also found snakes basking on it. So the dam itself, even when there wasn't much water present, was providing some habitat. Okay, so here's what we found. So this is looking at the percent pollutant removal. So looking from when the water's coming in to when it's coming out. So ideally, we would love to see numbers way up here at 100. That would mean that there's nothing coming out. It's all been removed. If a number is right at 0, that would mean it's the same coming in as going out. So this is the summary of all the 7 storms when there were no beaver dams present at all. So you can see, for these metals, we're removing some, but really not that much. Usually less than 20% was actually being removed. For the nutrients, we were actually getting some export. For the sediment, we're getting quite a lot of export, but that's probably a figment of how these samples are collected, where we wait till a really big storm happens so that we can make sure to get all of our samples done. And so in those big storms, it's maybe flushing out some of the sediment that would have settled out in the smaller storms. And then you see it's removing some pesticides as well. But looking at this, it was actually kind of alarming to see, okay, we'd built this big fancy facility and it's removing some pollutants, but it's really not doing that great of a job. And in retrospect, we can think about how some of the plants didn't grow on as much as we thought. It didn't quite function the way that we thought it was going to function. Okay, so that's without the dams. So what about with the beaver dams? Is it doing better or worse? So here's the summary of all those same pollutants with the 7 storms with the beaver dams. And you can see that for each of them, it's removing more pollutants when the beaver dams are present, right? Usually about half, which is pretty good. This was a retrofit. We would love to have had this facility be bigger for the 1,000 acres that it's draining, but this was the amount of room we had. So it's really encouraging, right? That answers the question. These beaver dams are helping to clean the stormwater better than when they weren't there. So how does it do that? It slowly filters water through the soil in the dam. So this is a video taken during one of the storms out at the facility. And you can see that the water doesn't just flow over the dam. A lot of it's sort of going through the matrix of the dam itself, which is a complex area of sticks and mud and grass. And we've known for a long time that soil is really good at cleaning stormwater. That's why we build things like rain gardens or stormwater planters that you may be familiar with, because that soil can help to filter and bind a lot of those pollutants. But the reason that when we're draining 1,000 acres of stormwater into one place, that we don't try to force it through some soil is that there's just so much force there that if we were to try to build, let's say, a soil berm or somewhere we would go through, it would just get blown out every storm, right? And we need to have a maintenance crew come out and repatch anywhere that it blew out after every single storm. And we just don't have the resources or the labor to do that. But that's exactly what the beavers are doing for free, right? After every storm, it does blow out a little bit and they come out and the next night patch up all the dams perfectly so that water filters through again, right? So it's sort of like this perfect self-sustaining system of something we wish we could create, but don't have the energy for, and the beavers do. And so now we're trying to think about how to coexist with them there. So this is an example of one of those sediment forebays where this is supposed to be 5 feet above the water, but the beavers have clogged up this little slot here with mud and grass. And this doesn't actually help to filter the water very much because then it bypasses this and washes out a road. And so I'll talk more at the end about how exactly we're building structures so that the beavers can still live in this facility and provide all their benefits without washing out our road or clogging up the infrastructure. And so now we think a lot about how to attract or deter beavers at a given facility as we design more of them, as we talk with other cities, or developers who are making ponds, if you want beavers to come there, or if you really don't, things that you can keep in mind. So the first thing is just that now, since they've been showing up at so many facilities, we just make sure to keep them in mind at all. So think about, okay, what would happen if a beaver came here? Would it be a disaster? And if it would, we should try to do something else. But keep in mind the plants that they like. So they often like willows, alders, and cottonwoods in this area. So if you want them, plant those things. If you don't want them, don't plant those things. We shouldn't have been surprised that they showed up to our willow monoculture. They also are really drawn to constrictions with running water sound. So that's why they're hanging out, in the slot here where the water is coming through, or those little rock waterfalls that we had built. So if you don't want them blocking up somewhere, make sure that there's not, a nice little constriction with running water that they can come back up. And then if you have room, try to make sure that there's room for that water to pond. So something that's great about this facility is that it's sort of down, tucked back behind some warehouses, and the water was able to raise up about 4 feet and pond a bit without threatening roads or houses or anything like that. So if you have room around a facility where it can pond up, then you don't need to worry so much if they come in, as opposed to if it's right next to something, then you might not be able to let that happen. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about stream temperature. So in general, in our area, many of our urban streams are too warm, especially for some of the trout and salmon that live in our area. So for example, a bunch of Chinook salmon died coming into Gresham during a really hot June a few years ago. And it's partially because of lack of shade on the streams getting warmer in general, and there are a bunch of what we call inline ponds that have been built within the channel of a stream that, when the pond is there, it gets a lot more sun on it, and it warms up the stream downstream. And we had been working a lot on trying to convince, landowners and farmers who had these inline ponds to find a way to take them out or change them in some way so that the stream remains cool. And at the same time, we had all these beavers building these ponds in the stream, right? And rightfully so, a lot of the people whose ponds we were asking to remove were saying, well, how come the beavers get to build the ponds and we don't? Like, does that make any sense? Should we be encouraging or discouraging these? And so we did a little study on the human and the beaver inline ponds in Gresham. So this study, we had 25 total ponds, 8 of them were beaver ponds, and 17 were human ponds. And we only chose dams that were at least 2 feet high, so they're creating sort of a substantial pond. Here's sort of a typical human-created pond, and this was a beaver pond. And we looked at hourly summer temperatures upstream and downstream of those ponds to see how the stream is changing. And here's a summary of what we found. So this first graph is the change in the maximum stream temperature downstream of the dam. So if you're comparing that stream upstream to downstream, did it add any heat on average? And so this is the average of all of the human ponds. There was a lot of variation, but it was about 2 to 3 degrees Celsius that it was increasing. And since a lot of these streams were already too warm for a lot of fish, that can make a big difference. Some ponds were increasing up to 10 degrees Celsius. But then look at this average for the beaver dams. It's hovering right around 0, and it's actually a little below 0. And I'll talk a little bit about why that is, but at least for the dams that were in Gresham, we weren't seeing that same amount of warming that we'd see from human dams. And here's sort of another way to look at it. This is where our regulations come from, the temperature standards, water quality standards for the dam. How many days of the summer is the stream exceeding that temperature standard? So this is looking at, if you look again at that stream upstream of the pond and downstream of the pond, how many additional days of exceedances are you adding? And so for the human ponds, we're adding on average 50 days, almost 2 months of additional exceedances where those fish are trying to struggle to live there by having that human pond there. Whereas again, the beaver averaged 0 with a little bit of variation around that. So what we were finding in this study was that human dams tended to add more heat than the beaver dams for a given situation. So if you had sort of the same size dam, the human dam, the same size and location and everything, the human dam would add more heat. And a big part of that was because these dams, of course, aren't made of concrete like the human dams. They're made of that matrix of sticks and mud and grass, and they're porous. So here's this dam in the summertime. The water's not flowing over the top of it, right? Some of these dams, some water does flow over the top, but a lot of it seeps through the dam itself. And what we were finding was that it was drawing water from that entire water column. So that the water starts to get stratified, right? It's hottest on the top and it gets cooler as you go down. So those human dams that are made of concrete, if it just spills over on the top, you're always taking that very hottest water and sending it downstream. Whereas if you're taking water from throughout the water column, like in the Beaver Dam, you're taking some of that hot water, some cooler water, and actually some cold water from down below and sending that downstream. And this is just sort of looking at all the different ponds we looked at and how much heat they were adding to the stream. So these are the ones that were actually cooling the stream all the way up to the ones that were heating a lot, and the different types of ponds. So the green are beaver ponds here. So they're kind of scattered throughout. Some were cooling and some were actually warming. And what turned out is that a lot of these, it was really related to these features here, where it depended on how hot or cold the water was coming into the pond. So if it was already hot, a pond didn't do a whole lot to it, but if it was cold water, it warmed it up more. How much shade was on that pond? Of course, the more shade, the less it's going to warm up. How much surface area? If it's a tiny little pond, not going to warm a lot versus a big one. That depth, if it's a really shallow pond, all that water is going to get hot versus a nice deep pond will have some cool water. And then we have a lot of high groundwater in Gresham. So if there's an area where the Beaver Dam can actually help connect it to the groundwater and get some hyperrheic flow coming through the substrate, that can really help too. So these beaver ponds that tended to cool the stream were in areas where the stream was already hot. There was shade on the pond. These tended to be like narrow incised channels. So they didn't have a lot of surface area. They were pretty deep, and there was groundwater in the area. Versus these few ponds that warmed it a lot were in an area where it was a cold spring coming in. So the water was cold right away. And then it was like a big, shallow, flat pond without any shade on it at all. And there wasn't a lot of groundwater there. So of course, you're going to see really different results. And then I just want to point out this one blue bar here. This is a human pond that actually cooled the stream a bit. And that one has a subsurface release. So it has a fancy structure that actually takes some cold water and sends it downstream. So that makes sense. And I mentioned all of these ponds were at least 2 feet deep, and they were all providing some cool water for fish or any other organism. Just by having that cool water down there, we'd often find fish hanging out in the bottoms of the pond. So regardless of what it's doing to the stream temperature overall, it's providing some cool water refuge for those animals. Okay, and then talking about stream complexity, I had mentioned that a lot of our streams are sort of narrow and channelized and incised. This is a typical stream in the middle of Gresham. It's just sort of the single channel. It's got blackberries on the side and sort of straight walls. And as we started to see beavers move, this is Johnson Creek, which flows through Gresham. As we saw beavers move into Johnson Creek, we were seeing, just over the last decade, some really cool things. So here's a dam right here, and downstream we were seeing a cobble bar, which I hadn't seen cobble bars anywhere. This creek had been a couple feet deep everywhere, but now we're seeing these exposed cobbles. It's kind of hard to see in this picture, but looking down at the creek here, there's a dam here, and the water started to go around the side here. So it's starting to create a side channel, a little second channel where the water can go. Here's another dam here, and downstream of it, we're starting to get a grass bar, and there's actually now one little cottonwood seedling that's starting to grow in there, and the water's splitting around it. And then creating some pools too. This was all really simplified with just sort of the same depth throughout. Whereas here, I stuck this stick down in here. I'm standing right next to a beaver dam, and it was over 4 feet deep, and that water was really cold afterwards. So it makes this scour pool as the water comes over the dam. And then this was really exciting when we go and we look at the stream bed, especially when we're looking for the bugs that are going to live down there. Usually in our urban creeks, it's just sort of this silted, sedimented stuff. And right after this dam was formed, the next summer I went out there, and for the first time in Gresham, I saw all of these gravels and cobbles that were unembedded. They're not stuck together in this silt and sediment. They were clean because they had been scoured out by the water coming over that dam. And the fish love to lay their eggs here. The bugs love to live here. This is really cool to see. And what was amazing about this is how quickly this is all happening. So I wanted to reference this figure that I think about a lot from a book called the Beaver Restoration Guidebook. I recommend this if anyone who hasn't checked this out yet. And there's this figure in here of sort of how a deep, incised, simple channel can, through time, as beaver dams start to come in and then they breach and then more dams come and they breach, through time create this really complex beaver wetland out of an area that used to be this really simplified channel. And this is something that I assumed would take, I don't know, 50, 100 years or something. And in our observations, we're starting to see some of this, grass bars and cobble bars, and even some of this after they breach some side channels, after just like 5 years or less after a dam comes in. So this is pretty exciting and encouraging to us that as this is happening, if we can help allow it to happen, these changes can happen pretty quickly. So then just to talk really briefly about conflicts, where, of course, when you have beavers, especially in an engineered system, they're going to come clog things up, live in a manhole. These were actually denning inside a manhole that came up a pipe. This is a dam right upstream of a culvert that if it washed out, could block the culvert, wash out the road. And especially our operations crews are really concerned, rightly, about these things. And as I was getting more and more calls where they're like, okay, Katie, you like beavers. How do we keep this road from washing out? And I was like, I have no idea. We called in some experts to help us build some structures. So we built coexistence devices like fences, pond levelers, culvert protectors, and they've been working great. And one thing I really want to note is that you need to get an expert. We used a group called Beaver State Wildlife Solutions, and they've done a great job. We first tried to put this stuff in ourselves, and it didn't work. The beavers got around it and built, and we had concluded, this stuff doesn't work. The beavers are too smart. And we had given up on it for years. And then someone said, no, you should really try an expert. And we did. And now everything's working fine. So you really need someone who knows what they're doing. It's easy to get this wrong. And I was so excited to see this quote recently from our operations manager, where he had hated the beavers for years. He always talked about he'd go out at night and shoot them. And he's like, these things are ruining my life. He'd have to go pull the grass out of this thing every 2 weeks. And then since this fence was built around it, he hasn't had to go out there in 2 years. And recently he said, these things are worth their weight in gold. Right. So that was really cool to see someone sort of change their mind and be really excited about coexistence. So overall, the beavers in urban areas we've found, at least in Gresham, can help clean the stormwater. They can help maintain stream temperatures, even create some cool areas. And they can really create some complexity really quickly, just in a few years. But the coexistence can be tricky, of course, as you come into conflicts. But if you have an expert helping you, some of those coexistence devices can be extremely helpful. All right, thank you.
That was awesome, Katie. Thank you so much. I just had a few thoughts, and I see someone has their hand raised. If you can put your question either in the Q&A or in the chat box, that'd be great. But yeah, I saw the comment that you made near the top of your presentation about something akin to, Beaver came into my life and changed everything. And I wasn't particularly on that track. And I feel like that is a resounding theme with so many people in the Beaver world. So, and also just seeing the data set on these, especially on what gets removed and those water temperature levels, I was just, those are data sets that I've been wanting to see for so long. So it's really exciting to have that out there. And I'm definitely going to be relying upon some of this as I talk to folks about water quality moving forward. And then finally, just the thought that humans simply cannot achieve the design and work energy that Beaver have, right? It's not possible. And we have to let them do their thing. So I'm going to see here if there are any particular questions. Okay, we have a question from Courtney. Are you considering publishing this data? They mentioned they were recently at a conference with a lot of both pro and anti-Beaver folks clamoring for more data, particularly with reference to water temperature. So just curious about what next steps are for you.
Yeah, good question. Yes, I've considered it. I'm definitely going to write up sort of what we do in our field is write like a technical report that can be passed along. I've been thinking about trying to do a peer-reviewed study. It's sort of hard though, because there's not much replication. There's not, it's sort of like this one place in time. But yes, I should give it a try because I think you're right. There's been enough interest that it might be useful for folks.
Okay. Where did you send the water samples for testing, and was that expensive?
Yes, it is expensive. So luckily, the only way we were able to do this actually is because our program already has a mandate to do water quality testing through our state Department of Environmental Quality. And so we already have a budget for it, and I was able to sort of use some of those funds to look at this question. But basically, each storm that we sample is about $10,000 just in the lab costs to get that suite of samples. And we used, the city of Portland has an internal lab that does all of our water quality testing for us. But yes, it is expensive. If you do fewer pollutants, we usually say it's about roughly $100 per pollutant per sample. So here we're doing, inlets and outlets and 3 samples per site and then 27 pollutants, and, it all adds up pretty quickly.
Oh, thank you. I'm going to go ahead and hand the mic over to Deni to present, and we'll get back and bring us all together afterwards for some more questions and discussion. So take it away.
Great, thank you. Just make sure that I'm doing all of this correctly. Is everyone seeing the correct version of that, Adam?
We are, yes.
Awesome. Okay, great. Well, I just want to thank Katie for that really fantastic talk that sets my talk up very nicely. And then also to Bonnie, Adam, and the Beaver Institute as a whole for the work that they do, and for extending the invitation to share some of my research interests. So my name's Deni Murray. I conducted my master's research on how beaver pond age, size, and shape are indicators of stream water quality in mountain streams in Utah. So shifting from urban-centric systems and much more into more wilderness areas, and asking some really similar questions to Katie's group. I do just want to acknowledge that this work was conducted through Utah State University, and I have 2 fantastic advisors, Dr. Janice Brainey and Bethany Nielsen, who I just want to acknowledge. And then I just want to note really quickly that I'm actually no longer at USU. As Adam mentioned, I'm pursuing my doctoral degree at the University of New Hampshire, which is where my email is tied to. So that's listed on the screen. So I no longer have a USU email if you'd like to get in touch with anything that I'm talking about today. So before I get into my presentation, I do just want to take a moment to acknowledge that the research that I'm presenting to you today was conducted at Utah State University and the surrounding landscapes, which is on the territories of the 8 tribes of Utah that have occupied this land from time immemorial. I also want to mention that in many languages of indigenous peoples, the beaver's name can be translated to little people, which I think is a commemoration of the respect and role that these animals have had in both the landscape and lives of indigenous peoples and people who have occupied North America from time immemorial even to present, as we saw in Katie's talk. So I want to start off just thinking about what a stream looks like. I think if you were to ask someone off the street to draw a picture of a stream, they would most likely draw something that looks like the photo on the screen. It's linear, it's free flowing, you just kind of draw a squiggly blue line. And headwater streams that are devoid of beaver because they were trapped out, especially in wilderness areas in the West particularly, they are linear systems that are usually made up of very fast flowing water, pools and riffles. Those are present in those steeper systems in terms of stream complexity, as Katie mentioned, but really these are linear systems. The water is moving very quickly. There's very little sediment that's being exported from these streams. But I think if you were to ask a member of the Ute tribe 600 years ago to draw their idea of a stream, it would probably look something like this, right? It's much more impounded. There's beaver activity everywhere. Beavers tend to really prefer headwater streams, these smaller tributaries, because they are a little bit more manageable. They usually occur in more confined valleys, which work really well for starting off dams. This idea of what a stream should look like has changed over time as we've removed beavers. And then now as we reintroduce beavers, right, we're starting to interact more closely with beavers and our idea of what a stream should and shouldn't look like. And beaver altered headwater streams, they contain these pools and riffles, but one really important aspect that they change in terms of shape is also creating complexity within the stream geomorphology. So we call those geomorphic units in the field of that I work in. So pools and riffles are something maybe you're familiar with if you go fishing a lot. Beaver ponds also contain margins, so these like inundated areas on the perimeter of ponds, and also backwaters where you have, more slow-moving water, has a lot of deep sediment. Beavers make these ponds. I'm sure all of us are very aware of how they make these ponds and why, but I think it's fun to think about, this is just their ecology. This is their lifestyle. And they are creating this heterogeneity in the landscape for the sole purpose of food consumption. But there are also some really interesting questions that we can ask about water quality, biogeochemistry, and geomorphology. Because we can observe that ponds differ in their shape and in their size and their position on the landscape due to the type of the stream that they impound. And this heterogeneity, or this variability in shape and size and age and position, is actually driving some of these water quality topics that we're talking about today. So Katie did a great job setting this up for me, but there are some major abiotic and biotic drivers of water quality in freshwater systems. These include oxygen, water temperature, organic matter, and what we call residence time, or like how long water and solutes spend in a given system. So, the kind of directionality of these variables kind of determines whether a system is like a source or a sink for a certain nutrient, for example, nitrogen. And these variables can change through space and time. And again, they can influence cycles of non-point source pollutants. So this includes nitrogen, phosphorus, and even heavy metals. And beaver ponds themselves, as I mentioned, are very complex. They have patchy environments within the pond that contain different levels of these four variables. And so, the net effect of a pond can sometimes be a little bit complicated because it kind of depends on the spatial mosaic, or what sort of composition each of these variables is kind of undergoing in the pond itself. And if you look at the peer-reviewed literature and you try to draw conclusions about, answering the question, like, do beaver ponds trap nitrate, for example, which is a non-point source pollutant, you're going to get contrasting and conflicting results. By and large, on a complex scale, they are trapping nitrogen, but if you were to look just upstream and downstream of a pond, we actually get really different results throughout space and time. And I think this is likely due to very stark differences between the shape and size and age of ponds. And so a lot of my research has been how can we categorize that? Are there patterns in these ages and sizes and shapes that are driving how beaver ponds influence freshwater quality in mountain streams? So for example, age and size, those things determine the distribution of water and sediments in a pond. It's not uniform. This is a figure from a paper I recently published that I'll share with you later, but you can see that the total depth, the water depth, and the sediment depth is really variable across one beaver pond, and that can influence the cycling of nutrients and metals within the given pond. And that also has a lot to do with shape, right? So like, where are these margins located? Where are these backwaters located? And what's the biotic and abiotic conditions in each of those units that may or may not be influencing how these non-point source pollutants are entering the pond, retained, and potentially leaving. So I'm going to share with you some case studies that were conducted in northern Utah beaver ponds. So this is a map of Utah in gray. The star is the Logan River watershed, which is selected there. We have 3 headwater streams. They're first order, so pretty small. And they all had primary beaver dam complexes on them. The photos are of the 3 ponds, so Spawn Creek, Temple Fork, and Little Bear. In terms of their water quality impacts, we're working in a really different system than Katie was describing earlier, in the sense that we're on U.S. Forest Service land. So we're in the mountains of Utah. We have relatively little direct anthropogenic impact. What we have a lot more of is non-point source pollutants from cattle grazing. So there's a good amount of cattle grazing in the uplands. So you can imagine when there's storms, the effluent and feces of the cows get into the rivers. So that's really the main source of nitrogen and phosphorus that we're dealing with in our systems here. Let's see here. So these ponds, I'm not going to go through this table, but I just put this here to show you that these ponds were selected intentionally because while they share some similarities in terms of being on a first order stream and primary ponds, they actually have very different physiological characteristics that allow us to make some conjectures about how age and size and shape actually do determine what we're seeing in our terms of our upstream and downstream water quality and the water quality within the pond itself. So in all of these ponds, we collected a lot of data over 2 years from 2017 to 2019. We took water samples upstream and downstream of each of these ponds during the summer season. We can't actually access these sites from like October to May. So we sort of only sample from May to September for these sites due to snow cover. But yeah, lots of water samples upstream and downstream. This kind of gets at this idea of influx and outflux of nutrients. And then we also took sediment cores. So we have water samples, but then we also have things that are going on in the sediments in beaver ponds. This is probably one of the most underlooked aspects of beaver pond biogeochemistry or water quality, is that a lot of what's actually happening in the water column is determined by what's happening in the sediments. And so we took sediment cores, so just sticking a big PVC tube down into the sediments as far as we could, extracting up sediment cores, and we took those throughout the ponds to kind of capture this spatial variability. And that's really helpful for letting us know, okay, this is what's coming in and this is what's going out, but what's going on in the middle? What are some mechanisms or some characteristics or reactions that are going on inside this little mesocosm that can maybe explain the inputs and the outputs? And then on one pond, particularly Spawn Creek, we did a very in-depth survey of the geomorphic units, as I mentioned earlier, which I'll explain a little bit more about later. But just really briefly, we were able to, we're collecting samples upstream and downstream. Again, we really wanted to know what was going on inside a pond. So we conducted a series of experiments where we were able to isolate water, isolate sediments, and measure the rate of production or retention of nitrogen in those water and sediment experiments. And we conducted those inside the beaver pond, which I will say the beavers had a great time messing with my experiments multiple times. So I could have used an expert at that point, but we got through it. So I'm just gonna start getting into some of the things we found. So age. The message here is that older ponds store more heavy metals in their sediments. So on the x-axis here, we have our 3 ponds, Temple, Spawn, and Little Bear, and then also a stream sample of sediments that we took. And these are ordered in age, right? So stream would be no beaver activity, Temple Fork is about 4 years old, Spawn is about 10 years old, and Little Bear, the ponds on Little Bear, about 12 years old. So you can see a really nice relationship between the age of the pond and the amount of sediments, the amount of metal per kilogram of sediments, right? So as our pond is older, it's able to trap more sediments and more metals. But, there's a lot of metals that are just kind of ambiently in the water column. They're not necessarily bioavailable. I forgot about this. Yeah, it was a time continuum, so 0 to 12 years. And between the stream and the oldest pond, it was 2.5 times higher, right? So we're definitely getting a water quality benefit from having beaver ponds on our streams. But yeah, as I was mentioning, some of these metals are just kind of dissolved in the water column. They're not necessarily going to be impacting, for example, fish or macroinvertebrates through like bioaccumulation. But what we can do is actually isolate a fraction of these metals that are bound to what's called organic acids and iron oxides. And those are actually representative of the type of metals that would be available for bioaccumulation, right? So if we look at that, we can like parse out our sediments into like low organic matter and high organic matter and the amount of metals that were previously in the water column. And you can see that in our sediments with really, really high organic matter, we have way more types of metals that were going to be bioaccumulated bound, right? So you can make the conclusion that like if you have an older beaver pond that has a lot of really organic rich sediments, it's going to contain more metals. As Katie mentioned, like measuring metals is expensive. Measuring organic matter of sediments is much cheaper. And so if we're able to draw these relationships between very basic characteristics about our ponds and water quality, that's a really nice next step for replicating these types of studies across many systems. So now I want to move on to size. The size of a pond can change throughout a season depending on the base flow. It could also change across a complex, right? You sometimes have really big ponds and then really small ponds. But the size of a pond is actually really important because it can determine how much water is moving into the system. And in that water are solutes, right? You have your nitrogen, your phosphorus, your heavy metals, and those need time for to be like sunk, quote unquote, sunk into the system, right? So if you have a system that's moving super fast, there's not really enough time for those solutes to be processed. So you can kind of envision this with this framework. So on the y-axis here, we have what's called biogeochemical processing, or like the capacity for a system to perform chemical work, right? So we have resource supply on the left side of our axis. So like how fast is that solute being delivered, which is really determined by your discharge of your water. And you also have residence time on the other side. So how long is that water coming into the system, and how long does it spend there? And based on this framework, we can kind of hypothesize that at these intermediate levels of I'm getting enough solute into my system that I can have a reaction, and my solute's spending enough time in the system to have a measurable effect, I'm going to have the largest impact on water quality. So we wanted to apply this model to our 3 ponds and see if that was true. And we did this using a sediment water interaction index, which we calculated with resource supply and residence time, which is essentially just the load of your solute times the amount of sediment over the discharge from your pond times the amount of water that's in your pond. So some really basic metrics here. And what we found is we took the log of that index and we plotted it against percent change between upstream and downstream for carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus, which is noted by the squares, the circles, and the triangles. So first I'm going to show you Temple Fork. That's our young pond. It's residence time limited, right? So if you look at this graph on the right side, you can kind of compare the results. And what we found was that the solutes just aren't spending enough time in this pond. They're just moving too quickly to really have a measurable effect upstream versus downstream. Little Bear, on the other hand, has a very long residence time, but it doesn't have a very high supply of certain elements that are really important for catalyzing reactions. So again, was having like below 20% impact on water quality change. Spawn Creek, on the other hand, had this intermediate effect, right? We were getting percent changes from 30 to 60% for our carbon and nitrogen and phosphorus. So, this theory does hold true where you have ponds in that intermediate sweet spot, you're going to have probably the most effect on your stream water quality. So the last metric I want to talk to you about in my 4 or so minutes remaining is shape. So pond morphology is really what we're finding is dictating the source sink dynamics of a system. So as I mentioned, we isolated one pond. This is me in a boat conducting a very in-depth survey. So we measured water depth. So is it rough? Is it smooth? Is it shallow? Is it deep? Sediment depth, shallow or deep, and sediment composition at a 4 meter by 1 meter cell scale across the entire pond. And from this, we were able to delineate each of these units. So this is a margin, this is a backwater, dam margin, a pool, the inflow riffle, and then these are just mirror images of one another. And these are based on criteria that other studies have developed for streams based on adjacency to those metrics that I mentioned: water depth, sediment depth, and composition. And what we did is a bunch of really nerdy experiments. We were able to create a mass balance. So what's coming into each of these units? Are there exchanges between the units? And how does that affect the export of nutrients from the pond itself? So again, we separated water column and sediments. We looked at how much nitrogen is coming in our sedimentation rates, how much is stored in the sediments. We also took some isotope samples to kind of confirm whether biological activity was having a role. We also looked at the rate of what's called mineralization and nitrification, which I know are complicated terms, but are essentially very important steps in the nitrogen cycle on its way to being permanently removed through denitrification, right? That's the permanent removal of nitrogen to a system. That's the ideal water quality benefit, is when your system is actually returning that nitrogen back to the atmosphere. And we did this with incubation experiments in the sediments and in the water column. And we also were able to look at the exchange between these two. All right, so the first thing I want to show you here is these biological proxies. So nitrogen cycling, I'm focusing on this element particularly because that's my research interest, but it is highly dominated by, the cycling of nitrogen is highly dominated by microbial activity. And so we took sediment cores from 3 of those geomorphic units, as I mentioned, and you can see some really interesting separation. So you have on this y-axis is the depth of sediment, and on this x-axis, I know it's a confusing metric, but on the left side, you can think about these as more plants. On the right side, you can think about these more as microbes, and you see a really distinct separation between the type of nitrogen processors that are in the riffle inflow versus the backwater or the margin. And then I also just want to show you this graph here, which the same colors apply to riffle, backwater, and margin, but we have some really this separation of ecological communities that are happening within the pond, which do go on to influence water quality. Similarly, we can look at how much oxygen is in our sediments, and this varies across our pond as well. So here, same colors apply again. Our backwater in the green is actually going anoxic, whereas our riffle is oxic. So even within a pond, you can have very heterogeneous oxygen conditions. I'm realizing I'm going a little bit over time, so I'm just going to run through these slides really quick. You know, our main conclusions was that in the margin and the backwater is where most of the biogeochemical work is happening. So, you know, where you have ponds with those units is going to be probably influencing water quality more. I'm going to skip through this, sorry. Okay, so I guess as just an overview of what I've talked about today, so pond morphology is really dictating the sourcing dynamic. We oftentimes treat beaver ponds themselves as a black box by just looking at influx and outflux, which is really useful, but there's also other metrics that we can measure, like looking inside the black box, which is important for nitrogen cycling, and we can actually measure some pretty basic characteristics about ponds, how old they are, satellite imagery, their shape, going out in a boat and like taking some bathymetry measurements that are a lot cheaper and more accessible than water quality measurements. And based on biogeochemical theory and what we know about water quality, we can actually make conjectures about how beaver ponds are going to influence water quality. So for example, I just want to return to this linear system without beaver, a complex system with beaver, and also wanting to mention beaver dam analogs and the evolution of a beaver pond over time. Actually, Katie showed this exact same figure. It's a very popular one in our field. But again, we can make conjectures that like as a beaver pond gets older, it's going to be storing more sediments and can potentially be trapping heavy metals, but maybe it's also going to be producing some nutrients as well if you don't have the right oxic to anoxic sediment ratios. Because those ponds with the anoxic and the deep sediments are definitely going to remove more of those non-point source pollutants than ponds without those. And those will, that distribution of sediment characteristics will change throughout the evolution of a beaver pond. All right, thank you for listening, and I will take any questions.
Thank you so much, Deni. That's incredible and sort of just mind-blowing as someone who's not a scientist or a researcher, just how granular we're able to get. And like as with most things, right? The surface tells you very little, and being able to get into the life story of a pond, it's pretty mind-blowing. So thank you for expounding upon that. Any questions for folks here? Anyone have a specific question for Deni before we open and go back to Katie and Elwin? How do you age the dams and complexes? Someone asks. Courtney asks.
Yeah, good question. We use satellite imagery, historical satellite imagery. So, I mean, very simply, like Google Earth history, Google Earth satellite data history is really good. Yeah, you know, a lot of these ponds are not really older than like 15 to 20 years old. So it's pretty simple to do that. Yeah.
Great. I'm curious if bringing Katie back into the picture, if either of you have any questions for the other, just seeing how related that your work is, and just being the theme of today. I would love to hear if you have any questions for each other.
Yeah, I'm curious if you've seen, sort of a shift in the beaver communities themselves and or in how people think about beavers over the time you've worked on them. It seems like, I don't know, it's getting a lot of attention recently. Populations are getting bigger, at least where I am. Have you seen that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I would say the beaver populations have been relatively constant in the Bear River Mountain Range. I have seen more activity, but I don't know if that's because of beaver numbers or because of I feel there's like a critical threshold that's reached of like once the stream has been impounded enough, it doesn't wash out as much, and so more beavers colonize it. These are pretty flashy streams, and so but yeah, and then in terms of your question, so I guess your first question, I don't know if they're increasing, but I do feel like the activity has increased, so potentially you could make that conjecture. And in terms of people's attitude, I definitely feel like it's improving. I think that the work that Beaver Institute's doing and a lot of other nonprofit groups to really translate the science to land managers, and especially even BLM and Forest Service too, I think has definitely helped. So I think it's improving.
Yeah. And one thing I've noticed even with the public is just sort of in the city, at least, the beavers hadn't been there for their lifetime, right? And so when the beavers moved in, it seemed like it was changing something that was good. I had one resident say, I've had a stream in my backyard for 30 years, and now suddenly I have a pond. And she just sort of thought that must be bad, right? And when we talked to her about the beavers and the ecological benefits and that they used to be there, she's like, oh, wait, this pond is good? And we're like, yeah. And she's like, oh, well, then it's fine. Then I can stay here, So just sort of the fact that it's a change, if people can start to get used to it, then it doesn't seem so bad.
Yeah, and I would say especially the streams that we work in are, I mentioned grazing is the main sort of land use in the area. And Joe Wheaton at USU has done a lot of work to work with private and public landowners to put in BDA structures. And I think that, really seeing the physical stream incision benefits has been massively important for improving public perception, because especially in the West, stream incision is one of the biggest threats to water quality and water security. And so to your point of just having the beavers do the work for you, if we can kind of catalyze it with the BDA is a really good idea. I think this whole idea of water quality has been a second wave of research of okay, we know that the physical benefits are there, but can we also connect that to the biogeochemical or the water quality implications as well?
Right. And I wanted to something that I was thinking about from a question I got about if I publish this stuff. I put a link in the chat to the tech memo that I wrote up about the temperature study. But I wanted to reach out to anyone who's here who would be interested in collaborating, especially if they're, academics or someone who are looking for a data set. I have a data set. It's not part of my job to publish it. So I'd have to do that on my free time, right? So I don't know if I'm going to do that. But if there's anyone out there who's looking for a data set and wants to actually publish it, hit me up. I would love for this data to be out there and be published. I'm just might not do it myself. So I put my email in the chat if anyone wants to do that.
Great, cool. Thank you. Yeah, I guess I have a question. Well, a question that came from, let's see, who did this come from? Well, the question is, what is the best shape for a pond to accomplish good water quality? Is there an ideal shape that a pond should be in?
It's a great question. So I think I can only speak to the systems that I work in, which are, smaller streams. But again, I think maximizing those backwater areas, right? That's the characteristics of those are the fine sediments, deep sediments, but shallow water. So in the pools form, you actually, like Katie was mentioning, you get that stratification. So even if you have anoxic sediments, your water is too deep for full denitrification to be happening. So that's a problem. If you have that ratio shallow water to deep sediments, that's going to be your best bet. Kind of like a wetlands. You can think about it that way, right? That's going to be your best bet for trapping those trapping nutrients, but also permanently removing them, right? That's the goal, because beaver ponds do blow out. So really what we want is this those metals that are tied to minerals, those are permanently removed. The nitrogen that's being put into a gas, that's permanently removed. And those deep sediments are going to be the best.
And then thinking about the temperature part of it, having some nice deep water sort of right before the dam so that it can be cool and send downstream. So I wonder if it, like many things, a variety, right? If you can have that nice shallow water with deep sediments in part of it and deep water in other parts, and just sort of the variety that can be brought with it.
Great. I'm curious, when thinking about things that are removed, I wonder, Katie, this is a question for you, well, for both of you, I guess, but Katie specifically, did you monitor the beaver ponds there in Oregon for carbon sequestration capacity?
Right. So I saw that question. I haven't looked at it specifically, but I'm realizing we did collect data on dissolved organic carbon. So I could at least look at that and see if there's a difference in that. That would be good to know. I don't know.
Okay.
And that's something, yeah, we should add that to our future monitoring.
For the both of you, this is from someone who said they're having issues with the Army Corps of Engineers in Central North Carolina. Any suggestions to approach changing their attitudes towards the stream impacts of beavers?
I don't have any suggestions. Do you?
I think just keep trying.
Okay. Maybe
Yeah.
I've had one really good interaction with the Corps recently, and it wasn't about beavers. We're working on some other project with them, and maybe just trying to build personal relationship. There was one engineer, and I went out in the field with her a few times, and we talked about things, and we seem to have a good relationship now. So maybe if I broached beavers with her, we would have started a different place. So I don't know. Try to make friends. That's my only thought.
Great. Deni, have you looked for methanotropic microbes in beaver ponds?
That's a great question. Yeah, I didn't do any genomic studies to specifically identify methanotropic bacteria, but actually to the question earlier about the carbon sequestration potential of beaver ponds, a data set that I have that I need to publish that have not been published is a carbon budget for these ponds, which we did measure methane evasion from, which unsurprisingly, those areas that are anoxic and have deep sediments, they're a nitrogen sink, but they're a carbon source, right? So this is where, what's your goal with beaver ponds? Is it to address climate change, which would be a very different story than non-point source pollutants? There's some super interesting research going on right now in northern Alaska, where the thawing of the permafrost is opening up new territory for beavers to colonize. And they are having a heck of a time with a lot more methane coming out of those systems. And so, in terms of carbon, that's like a super different biogeochemical reaction and set of kind of water quality priorities than non-point source pollutants. So, to the point of the question being like, kind of depends on what your goal is with beaver ponds. So I think you could get different answers depending on what your intention is.
Awesome. Thank you. This is for both of you. How do you think that the benefits of beavers can best be leveraged in future mitigation projects focused on freshwater quality?
In general, I would just say, what we're finding is try to encourage and allow space for the beavers to come in if they can, and make sure that if they come in, it's not going to be a disaster. So for example, sometimes in our restoration projects, if we only plant things that beaver like to cut down, then it all gets mowed down and we don't have any shade on the stream, right? So we've switched to planting half things that beavers like and half things that the beavers generally don't like, so that we still have some shade there. And things like we've changed our buffers to be bigger around streams so that we don't have roads and houses right next to it. So if the beavers come in and make a wetland, we don't have to take that dam out or put a pond leveler in. We can just let it be. So I'd say in general, try to make a place attractive to beavers and allowable for them to be there, and then just let them do their thing.
Great. Did you have any thoughts on that, Deni?
No, I think
Great.
you nailed it.
Great. See here. What is, this is a good one for both of you. What is a good number of beavers in a group to start watershed restoration? This is like, I guess, kind of like that pond shape question as well. Is there an ideal number?
I don't know, Dina.
I guess I can speak a little bit of like beaver like life history. So, beavers mate generally for life. They have litters every year of kits. Those kits can number from 4 to 5. And they all the litter from the previous year sticks around to help rear the next year's litter. And when the males are 2 years old, they get this like thing turned on in their brain of like, I need to go find my own pond. And that's when you get these new colonizations generally happening, is with young males. You'll also see sometimes like random trees half chewed on their way. They're like practicing. But I guess you can start with one young male. That is sufficient. They will release pheromones to attract females. Making sure that there are females like in the relative vicinity is important, but the young males can travel like quite far from where they were born. So one is sufficient. I can definitely recommend reading some of work by Julie Young at Utah State University. She's looking at they've done a lot of trapping and then relocation of beavers to sites that have BDAs on them to try to catalyze the maintenance, but I think they've been able to do it with a pair. Usually is ideal, but you can do it with one.
Great, that's very informative and helpful. Another question, Deni, this is a little bit more nuanced one. Have you seen differences in the amount of sediment and the pond complexity as a function of age and position and the sequencing of ponds? That as older ponds have more sediment and are more complex than younger ponds, as each dams cut off sediments inputs into downstream ponds and therefore limit the ability to create these various features in ponds. And this is just in the chat. If yeah.
I was just reading that. Thank you. I was like, that was a long question. That's a really good point, and I didn't look at that. Right, like, oops, I'm sorry. I need to plug in my computer.
Oh. I know the feeling. All of a sudden, it's here we go.
So I didn't look at sequences, right? And that's a really good point. Like what happens in this pond actually has a spiraling effect of what happens in the next pond. That's a great project for someone to do. I would love to know the answer to that, but I don't. I mean, I'm guessing yes. The answer is yes, that it does influence downstream. But I don't have kind of metrics to assign to that answer.
Right. This is a bigger picture one for both of you. What are the most important knowledge gaps that need to be filled in relation to beavers' impact on polluted freshwater systems? And a second part, the follow-up, is do you have any recommendations for promising future research directions?
I'll jump with what I'm thinking about. One thing I think a lot about is the ultimate fate of a lot of these pollutants. So I really like what Deni's talking about, where if that nitrogen can actually get denitrified and go up into the air rather than just sort of being trapped there. And, in our stormwater system, something like a heavy metal, it's never going to change. It might change what it's bound to or its form, but, a lead particle is going to be a lead particle forever. And just where is it and is it available? And so thinking about what happens with those. So in our altered stormwater systems, we'll go dredge that out maybe every 5 or 10 years, test the sediment. It'll probably get hauled to a landfill depending on how polluted it is. But thinking about if something's more out in a natural system and if it's acquiring pollutants, sort of what's the ultimate fate of that? And I'd like to know more about that.
Yeah, I'll echo that. That would be super interesting. I think for myself, like response to storms and mountain streams, what's going on in the winter time. We only measured in summer. What's happening in these other seasons? What's the annual effect? And then actually the question that was brought up earlier about a complex wide study on shape and sediment and age would be super useful, because very rarely do beaver ponds occur singly, right? They're usually in a complex. So
that's great. That's wonderful. Thank you both so much for being a part of this. I've learned so much, and I just imagine everyone who's attended has as well. Any closing thoughts that you'd like to share as we end this event today?
Sure. And I'll even tie into one of the questions I saw in there, thinking about like, how do you even measure the one beaver pond? Where do you put your loggers to be upstream of it? And like you're just talking about, it's hard to find what's upstream because there's another beaver pond and there's this and that and everything's complicated and then there's another stream coming in. So just thinking about, what I've learned most with working with beavers is that, everything is change and it'll never be the same the next year. And that's sort of the biggest, like, when I think about how to live with and embrace beavers, I feel like the biggest barrier I've seen with people is just sort of the sense of control, and that you need to let go of a sense of control. And that can be really hard for people, where even if it's good, it's not going to hurt anything. I like to know how it's going to look, and I like to know what I'm going to do when I come to work next year, and work on it. And sort of giving that away to a different species can be really hard. But that if that shift can happen and just sort of embrace the change and the messiness, that's where I've seen the most benefits.
Great. And Deni?
Yeah, I like that idea of like giving away control. I think I actually wrote something similarly, kind of reflecting on my presentation of just like beavers are such a reminder that ecosystems are stochastic and chaotic and cannot be put into linear boxes, as much as scientists love to do that. And I think it is like their impact on the landscape as a keystone species really is like a humbling experience, visual and an emotional experience of just like how complex our systems are that we're trying to conserve, protect, understand. And just appreciating nature's chaos sometimes is embracing it is the best way to do it.
That's great. I thank you for those closing thoughts. Yeah, we are not in control, and nor should we be, probably, ultimately. So yeah, it's a wonderful time with you both, and thank you. And just want to give a shout out for some things that are going to be coming up. The next few months, we're going to be switching things up. We've been listening to the surveys that we're getting back, so we're responding. And the next couple sessions, our webinars with Beavers Uncovered, are going to be panel discussions. So we're going to be jumping right into discussions. And the next one is looking at recent Supreme Court rulings on the Clean Water Act, Sackett versus EPA, and Arizona versus Navajo Nation on water rights. These are topics that I need some help wrapping my head around and understanding what that means for the future of water. So the future of water will be happening next month on September 26th. Stay tuned for more information and about the panelists. And then, of course, we do this and we would love to have more support so we can do it better. So please donate if you can. And also, you can take a webinar survey, which we do look at those and sort of fluctuate our programming based on that as we move forward. So thank you all so very much, and have a wonderful remainder of your Thursday. And again, thank you, Katie and Deni. This was awesome to have you here. Goodbye, everyone.